Dizzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. Today is part 2 of our baby quilt along, and we will be putting together our quilt top. So hopefully you have your 20 blocks all put together or all pieced, so 10 darks and 10 lights. And now we can start putting them together into rows and then attaching those rows into a quilt top. So let's get started. All right, so we're gonna start piecing our blocks together. So we ended the last video with the basically planning of our fabric pairings and organizing everything into piles in the configuration we'll need to start piecing our blocks together. So I've got my pieces laid out here. This is a light block, so it's got a light square in the middle and the darker ring around it. We're trying to get to this. So this is the finished block. It measures 10.5 inches square, which means that when it's sewn into our quilt top, this block is gonna measure 10 inches, making the total quilt top 40 inches wide by 50 inches tall or long. So this is another light block. It's got the light square in the middle, the dark ring, and then the light outer ring. So for each block, whether a light or a dark, you're gonna sew these together the exact same way. Starting with a 2.5 square in the middle. So if I move this out of the way, we're gonna sew this to this and then add this square, making a row. And then once our row is sewn and pressed, we're gonna add borders onto it, effectively making a small square. Once that's sewn and pressed, we're gonna add the outer border, finishing our block. All right, so now all of the piecing in this block, and basically in quilting in general, is at 1/4 inch. All right, so every seam is at 1/4 inch. So in the list of material, I listed a 1/4 inch foot, which is basically this. This is the one for my Juki machine. And you'll see that it's very narrow. So if I just sew following the foot, the edge of my foot, it gives me a very accurate 1/4 inch seam. If you have one of these for your machine, highly recommend you use it. If not, you can always mark the bed of your machine with painter's tape or whatever. But it's going to be very important that your seams are consistent and as close to 1/4 inch as possible, because when it comes time to sew these blocks together into a row, let's say, you want to make sure that each block measures exactly 10.5 inches, and that's impossible if your seams are not consistently 1/4 inch. All right, so the other thing is you choose how you want to press your seams. I pressed the first seam, so the seams in the middle row open, so they're open flat. And then every other seam I pressed towards the solid piece of fabric to avoid extra bulk due to like pressing these seams towards another seam. So it just makes for a very flat block, which is going to then be easier to quilt once we get there. All right, so again, organize your piles. Make sure you've made your decisions as far as what fabric is going to go with what fabric, and then we can start piecing. A lot of people like to chain stitch, which basically mean that you can take these two piles, for example, and just sew the two squares together, one after the other, without cutting your thread, and then separating each one and then adding that block and chain stitching through that. This saves on thread and is often a lot faster. But if you're a beginner at this, it's very, very easy to lose track of which fabric goes where when you do it like that. So I suggest, I mean, you do what you want to do in the end, but I suggest you piece each block completely before moving on to the next block. All right, so we will get started piecing our blocks. All right, so we're gonna start piecing. So I'm gonna grab my center square and the 2.5 square that goes next to it, putting the fabric right sides together. I'm just gonna sew a seam at 1/4 inch. I don't usually pin when I quilt, just because quilting cotton is very nice to work with. It's not slippery at all. It typically does what you tell it to do. So I don't find that on these very, very short seams, I need to pin. However, if you want to pin, if you feel better pinning, you know, go ahead and do that. So another thing that garment makers will know to do, and very few quilters do, is backstitching at the beginning and end of your seam. The reason why very few quilters backstitch is because ultimately your blocks or your pieces are going to be sewn with other pieces and seams will intersect, which means they probably won't come apart. However, if your blocks are going to sit there for a bit, or if you're going to be manipulating and pressing and stitching them together, chances are some of your seams could come undone. I mean, it's happened to me on a couple of blocks where one seam had come undone and I hadn't noticed it, and I went to quilt and there was basically a hole in my quilt top, which was not fun. So when that happened, I decided, okay, I need to backstitch at the beginning and end of every seam. So that's what I do. Don't feel like you need to do that. Chances are you'll be fine, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So I backstitch at the beginning and end of every seam. All right, first seam done. We're not going to press it right away. We're just going to add our other dark square to the other side, lining everything up, and then again sewing at 1/4 inch. And there you go, we have our first row. Now typically I would go to the iron and press these seams open, but just to avoid getting up right now, plus my iron is cold, I'm just gonna finger press these open and make sure they stay open when I piece another piece of fabric to it. So just use your fingers to kind of press them open like this. And then we're gonna add a 6.5 inch rectangle to one side, lining everything up, and then sewing that at 1/4 inch. Just check underneath as you're sewing to make sure your seam didn't flip to one side, and then just continue sewing. Or you can always use pins. All right, here's one side added. And now I'm going to go ahead and add the other side before I get up to go press everything. All right. And there's the middle of our square all sewn up. So I'm going to go press these, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the seam towards the solid piece of fabric, like I explained before. Just shoving them to the side like this and pressing them with your hot iron. And that's another thing. I like steam when I'm pressing. I've heard it said that steam is no good on quilting cotton because it's effectively water and you're going to shrink the fabric. I have never, ever, ever in my 15 years of quilting, I've never had fabric shrink due to steam. And I like my seams really, really flat. So I like to use a lot of steam. So we're going to go ahead and press this flat and then attach our outer ring. Here we go. Inner square all done. So now we are going to attach 6.5 rectangles to one of the sides or two of the sides. Now, when I start a new ring, I like to put the 6.5 pieces to the side with the seams. Don't ask me why. That's just, I like the look of the blocks that way. It makes very little difference, to be honest. So I'm going to put my 6.5 inch piece, line it all up, and then again, sew at 1/4 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and attach my other piece before I get up to press. All right, so now we're gonna again go press towards the solid piece of fabric. I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. And now we're ready to attach the final two pieces, so our 10.5 rectangles to the last two sides. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're almost done. And there we go. All that's left now is for me to press these last two pieces outwards, so towards the solid piece, and I have myself another light block. So I'm going to continue piecing all of my blocks. I'm going to piece my 10 light blocks and then my 10 dark blocks. And then we'll come back here and make decisions as far as layout and what block is going to go next to what. So go ahead and finish all your blocks, and then we'll come back and start assembling our quilt top. One thing I wanted to mention before we start piecing our rows together is hopefully you checked the description box of video number 1, where I list all of the measurements, and those are the accurate measurements, because in the video itself, in video part 1, I give you the wrong information. So all of the description, or the description box, contains all of the measurements you'll need. So the finished quilt measurement, what to cut, how many to cut, and in what dimensions. So yeah, so hopefully you looked at that before you started and put all your blocks together. All right, so we are ready to start putting our quilt top together. Hopefully you've got your 20 blocks. I've got my 20 blocks here. I've got my darks and I've got my lights. Now, if you have a floor space or a big table that you can pick all of your layout on, then I would suggest you do that. So basically, get some floor space or a big table, because you need to basically lay out your blocks in a way that's pleasing to you in a 4x5 layout. So 4 blocks across and 5 rows down. And that's how we're going to lay out our 20 blocks. Now, I don't have a huge amount of space, and I really don't mind the randomness anyway. So I'm probably just going to take a dark block and then put a light block next to it, and basically go through my piles, trying to lay them out in a way that I like. So I'm not going to be able to show you my full layout just because I don't have the room for it. But basically what you're going to do is start your first row with a dark block. And again, really, you don't need to do the dark light. You can just start with all the darks at the top and put your lights at the bottom. You can do a gradient from one corner to the next. So start with the lights in the corner and then put your darker ones in the other corner. Like, there's lots of different layouts you can pick. So try a few. Just throw your blocks on the floor or on the table and take pictures, and then decide which layout you like best. And then once you've got your layout all picked, what you want to do is make piles for each row. So the first block on the left, you're going to grab it, then put it on top of the second block, and then put it on top of the third block and the fourth block. And basically make piles for each of your rows. So you're going to have 5 piles of blocks next to your sewing machine. And this is where I'm saying taking a picture of your layout is so important, because that way you won't lose track of what goes where. Make sure your piles are in the order that the block appears in your row, and you should be fine. But just in case, take a picture. So I'm just gonna very quickly lay out my blocks in rows and then do my little packages or piles for each row, and I'll come back when I'm done. All right, so I've made all of my decisions. I've played around with the layout. Well, I didn't really play around. I basically threw the blocks randomly, and I did go with the dark light pattern. But yeah, I think I went pretty random. So we'll see anyways what that does. It's not a big deal. Doesn't need to be perfect. But I've got my 5 piles now on my table right next to my sewing machine, which you can't see because it's off to the side. But I'm basically going to sew each row, starting with the first one and then going down to the 5th one. And I'm not going to be pressing each seam as I sew it. I'm just going to wait for the whole row to be sewn, and then I'm going to press my seams towards the full piece of fabric. So if you remember, when we sewed our blocks together, we would press our seams towards the full piece. You're going to do the same thing when you are sewing them together. So one thing I tried to do as I was laying them out is making sure that each block was turned in such a way that a full piece would get sewn to a piece with seams in it. That way it'll be super easy to press your seams towards your full piece here. And I'm sorry, Bear is playing with the tripod. So yeah, everything should be fairly straightforward when it comes to then sewing your rows together, because your seams will all be going towards your full pieces of fabric. Hopefully that makes sense. So go ahead and sew all of your rows together. So you should have, again, 4 blocks into each of your piles here that you're going to sew together into a row, making sure that a piece that is full or uninterrupted gets sewn to a side that has the seams. And then once your row is all pieced, then you can go to your pressing station and press the seams towards the full pieces in each row. And then once I've got all 5 of my rows sewn and pressed, I'll come back here. And just a reminder, jumping in real quick, I said that in the first video, but just in case, all of your seams are going to be at a 1/4 inch. So again, most quilts, I don't think I've ever come across a quilt that did not have 1/4 inch seam allowances. So whether you're piecing your blocks or then piecing them together and then piecing your rows together, everything is done at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's pretty important to be consistent with your seam allowance when it comes to sewing your blocks together into your rows, if you want your corners to line up between each row. So, and we'll look at that in a minute once all of our rows are sewn. All right, so I've got my rows all sewn and I've made a pile with all 5, and basically I've got number 5 on top. So this is row number 5, number 4, number 3, number 2, number 1. And that's because when I put my rows together, I like to start from the bottom. And that's just a personal thing. It's just easier as I add each row to go and press. Only one row ends up on my pressing table. I don't know why, but it's just harder in my head for me to add rows from the top down. It's just easier from the bottom up. So however method you pick is fine, but I'm starting from the bottom. So this is row 5 for me. So now I'm going to put these to the side for a second. And I'm just going to bring row 5 over here. And I'm going to take row 4 and place it on top, right sides together, so that we can now sew this seam at a 1/4 inch. Now the important thing, grab your pins here because you're going to need to pin at the intersection of these blocks. So because we pressed all of our seams towards the solids, okay, so because we pressed to the solid pieces, they should be nesting like this. So one seam goes one way and the other goes the other way. Hopefully that's how it worked out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each piece, make sure I get like a little X basically, and then put a pin right in the middle. So my pin is right on the seam on both sides. And that's going to make sure or ensure that when I press my seam here, whichever direction at this point, it won't matter, then I have a very nice corner right here. Everything else I can leave hanging, but whenever 2 blocks are intersecting or 2 seams are intersecting, you want to make sure that you pin there. There you go. And then last one over here. So basically I'm putting 3 pins in this entire row, making sure that my pin is exactly where the seams meet. And now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and stitch at a 1/4 inch. Once that's done, I'm going to press the new row. So row number 4, I'm going to press it upwards and have the seams go towards row 4. And then I'm going to add row 3 here and do the same thing. So just match up your seams, sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then press each new row up. And after you've done that to all 5 rows, then you'll have a completed top. All right, here we go. My top is done. I love it. It's very, very cute. I love that it's girly, but it doesn't, like, it's not overwhelmingly pink. So yeah, I'm very, very happy with this. All right, so once you attach all of your rows together, you should have a beautiful, beautiful quilt top. And obviously this is way too big to show on here, so I took some pictures and we'll be putting them up. But yeah, I'm super, super happy with my little baby quilt. I think it'll be a really great gift. So that's it for part 2 of our video, or our quilt along. Once again, if you have any questions about any of the steps I talked about, please put them in the comments box below. In part 3, which is going to come out probably in early October, we are going to baste our quilt sandwich. So basically take our gorgeous top, add some batting and a backing fabric, and stitch them together temporarily or pin them together so that we can quilt. And then once the quilting is done, we are going to attach our binding. So part 3 is basically when we're gonna put it all together and end up with a beautiful, beautiful quilt. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up on your way out and consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss part 3 when it comes out. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.